Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Pro Pharma Talks. My name is Alex Hernandez. Alongside me as always is Dr. Craig Stern. And we're kind of branching off of our last week's topic about myths. So we're going to go on into beliefs and whether there's any scientific reasoning behind it. And our scientist here, our in-house scientist, Dr. Craig Stern, is going to help us go through these beliefs and whether or not they're just a belief or fact, right? Is that
what we want to know is there any science behind it? I mean, people may still have these beliefs, etc. But the question is this just something your mom told you, your grandmother told you, or is there actually some science behind it? So we're going to try and deal with bringing in the scientific component, and then people can always choose to believe whatever they wish.
Right, and to be fair, your dad and your grandfather could have told you too.
They could have, yes, just to be fair.
Just to be fair. Well, going on to our first belief, we'll call them beliefs. We'll say the first belief is whether or not cold temperatures bring on the cold or the flu. I've always believed this. I don't know if there's any real scientific fact behind that.
Well, number one is there isn't any scientific fact behind it. Cold and flu are either viruses or bacterial infections. So what we're dealing with here is the fact that people, irregardless of the temperature, have to be close to people who are sneezing or coughing that lead an aerosol that gets into the air. That, of course, is transferred or people breathe in. And as a result of that, they get colds or the flu. Now, during cold temperatures, obviously, meaning during winter time, people tend to stay inside. So staying inside frequently is closer to other people, and if someone has the sniffles or they have a cold or whatever, then clearly people are going to bring that up. But it's not about just the temperature.
Right.
It's about the fact that you're in close proximity to other people.
Okay.
So that transmission can occur, and the transmission is the critical issue.
All right, so I don't have to wear my sweater outside if it's too cold, just because I'm avoiding getting sick, right?
If you need a sweater, wear a sweater.
All right, let's move on to the next one because it's kind of related a little bit. Because I've always heard this one too. After you take a shower or your hair's still wet, to not go outside because that can also give you a cold.
Yeah, same issue here, and that is there is no science behind having wet hair or taking a shower and going outside. Clearly, if it's cold, you want to think about that and deal with
logic will tell you
intuitively to protect yourself.
Right.
But once again, the main issue here with regard to colds has to do with proximity to people that have sniffles, a cold, something where they're coughing, they're sneezing, etc. Proximity, getting close to people, breathing that aerosol, that's what the issue is with regard to colds and flu. And whether it's going outside with your hair wet, etc., is really not an issue. There isn't any science behind it. Clearly there is some intuitive issue that maybe it doesn't make any sense that we tell our children, our grandkids, and whatever, but with regard to science, no.
Maybe they just didn't want you to go outside, so they said, no, you're going to get sick.
Well, we should here emphasize that the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, does have rules, and the rules are wash your hands, because if you're in close proximity and someone has coughed or sneezed, their hands are dirty. Use sanitizers if you wish. Deal with don't touch your mouth, your eyes, etc., because you don't want to transfer it to one of them to get a further infection. But that's just fundamental stuff for dealing with colds, because a cold is going to last 7 days no matter what you do to it, and that's going to happen. What you're trying to do is to decrease the amount of interaction that you have with someone who has a cold.
Right. And also, you shouldn't really cough or sneeze into your hands, right? It's into your elbow portion.
Yeah, the best way to do it is to cough into your elbow, so you're not, because you don't
you don't really
you
touch
don't shake elbows.
Yeah, that's true. So this next one kind of hits on various angles, and it might actually hurt some people, but at least emotionally. The flu shot causes the flu.
Yeah.
Be nice, Craig.
A flu, the flu virus.
Right.
It's an antigen, meaning you're introducing a foreign thing into your body. The flu has over 150 different types. There are a few main types that cause flu year after year after year. Some of them are more virulent than others, some are less virulent. So the bottom line here is that you get a flu shot, it covers you for the 6 or so different viruses that can cause the flu, but there can be another virus out there, and as a result of that, even though you get the flu virus, you could the flu vaccine, you still could get the flu from another one of the 150 so types that are out there.
Right.
So that can still occur. And the other part of it is that this is part of the whole argument that's going on today about some of the drug companies in developing super vaccines to try and kill as many of the different flu antigens as possible.
As they should.
As they should. Yeah. Bottom line is the flu shot covers you, hopefully for the main ones that are going to be out there. There is always the chance that something else can occur. And if your immunity is low, you're going to get it. So people who have cancer, people who have autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis, people who have issues with regard to low immunity for whatever reason due to drugs or they're on steroids or things like that, they should be careful because that lowers immunity, and as a result of that, they can have further problems. But it's not about the flu shot. It's about the fact that the disease itself has many variants. Hopefully they don't affect you, but some could, and as a result of it, you could get it, and it has nothing to do with a shot.
Right, and it's mainly there just to stop the spread, right?
Yes.
I mean, stop you from getting it, but also stop it from spreading out to others. This one kind of hits close at home. I love coffee, and I've loved coffee since I was a child, which explains a lot if this is true. Coffee can stunt childhood development.
Yes.
Not in the brain, though. It
didn't stop you from your football career, though, did it?
I stopped that football career.
Yeah, let's talk about this for a minute. It's common. My mother even used to say this to us. So we couldn't drink coffee when we were kids because she was worried about it, and then we would have smaller stature, etc. The bottom line here is coffee is caffeine. It contains caffeine.
Of course, right.
And if you have this is a dose relationship. If you have 1 or 2 cups of coffee, then there's really nothing to say. There isn't any science behind stunted growth. There have been multiple studies about it. Nothing has shown that it influences bone. However, the main issue here is that if you have a lot of it, that you can get all of the impact of caffeine, and that caffeine can make you anxious, it can make you nervous, it can make sure that you can't sleep. Those issues may be considered that something that is going to influence you, but it's very general. It has nothing to do with your bone issues. I did identify one that there is no difference in bone health even with high coffee intake. So even if you drink a lot of cups of coffee, from the American Journal of the College of Nutrition. So bottom line is to realize that it's not going to cause childhood development, or it's not going to stunt growth.
Right.
But if you have someone who likes to drink a lot of coffee as a kid or otherwise, you don't want to cold turkey them because that can, cold turkey creates all of its own problems.
Right.
You get headaches, you get nauseous, and all of that, the same as you would if you ate something that had a lot of caffeine. So what you want to do is you want to taper slowly versus trying to do it. And when I say slowly, you don't just cold turkey and stop all the coffee on one day. You cut it down by 1 cup, 2 cups a day until you cut it down to to 0 or at least 1 cup a day.
Or you can just give your kids hot chocolate and make them think it's coffee.
Yes, you can. I'll take that chocolate.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, this one, producer M needs to listen up and listen closely. Whether or not cracking your knuckles leads to arthritis.
Yes. Yeah, she's going to do it in crack inches for you. Where did this come from?
I don't know.
It came from the fact that people who crack their knuckles, you hear a pop. And the issue was hearing a pop that somehow you would be influencing the space between your bones, and as a result of that, you'd have bone on bone, and it would lead to some sort of arthritis. The reality of it is that's not true. The cracking of your bones does deal with certain, quote, bubbles that are there in between your knuckles, but studies have been done to demonstrate that even when you crack your knuckles, there's still micro bubbles that are left. So it's not taking it all away. It's not creating a whole new environment. Bottom line is that this doesn't have any science behind it. What it does indicate is that both multiple studies, and there have been a lot of them with regard to this, and there's even been some mathematical models designed to deal with this. And at the end of the day, it may be bothersome. It may bother someone who sits near them. Right. Yes.
Yes, it's very bothersome.
But at the end of the day, it doesn't have anything to do with arthritis. The bubbles are still there. It may not be something that you want to do, because if you have a malformed bone and you're cracking it, then you are going to have some issues with regard to your bone that has nothing to do with arthritis, but has to do with some orthopedic problems that you want to do. So the one thing that is important and has been shown is that when you crack your knuckles, it reduces grip strength and potential tendon injuries in your fingers. And so it's not arthritis, but you can have pain and you can have issues that are not arthritic, but are still painful and still have problems with grip strength when you're shaking hands with someone and you don't have the same strength that you normally would in doing it.
Explains a lot.
It's less gross than cracking your neck.
Okay, yeah. Well, moving on. Well, okay, starve of fever, feed a cold. What is that? What does that mean?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah, the question, I mean, I've heard this, I think, once again, I think my mother brought this up and all of that.
Is this another one of those old terms? I mean, have you heard this one, Em? I haven't heard this one.
That's not a Latino thing.
Yeah. Okay.
The question is, where did this come from? And the issue is that people would look at this and they would say, well, there's a fever, you're hot, so as a result of that, you want to starve it, and maybe it'll bring your temperature down. But if you have a cold, you have to eat so that you'll have enough strength in order to live out the cold. Okay. The problem with both, there's no science behind this, but the bottom line here is that fevers last maybe a day or two.
Right.
So when you're talking about starving a fever, if you have a fever, you probably don't feel very well. You're probably not very hungry. So as a result of that, starving it in some ways just doesn't do anything, because you're not hungry to deal with it at all. But 1 or 2 days of not eating or eating some smaller amount is not going to be a huge impact on your health.
Okay.
On the other hand, colds last a week. If you starve yourself, then you're going to be less vital, less ability to fight off of a cold, etc., just by having enough energy. And most importantly, hydration, because most colds have a major impact on dehydration. So irregardless of what you eat, hydration is absolutely crucial, because you're losing what's known as insensible losses of water through your skin when you have a cold, and as a result of that, you need to replace it. So you need water and hydration. whether you can eat or not depends on how you feel, and clearly it's better if you're eating over a long period of time than not eating at all. That's where it comes from. There isn't a lot of science behind it, but intuitively it makes sense physiologically.
That's where the soup comes in, the yummy chicken soup, right?
Yeah, chicken soup and a warm tea with lemon and honey. It's a classic old remedy. It deals with the dehydration, gives chicken soup, so it gives some protein, and then the tea is hot, so it helps to deal with a sore throat or keep your throat moist. And of course, lemon and honey. The honey is soothing for the throat, and a anti-cough, antitussive kind of effect. And of course, the lemon somehow is helping to dry things up. Either way, it makes sense from a nutrition standpoint, but at the end of the day, it has nothing to do with whether you're starving and dealing with the cold.
And don't forget the warm tequila with lime and honey. I mean, that is also helpful.
I think I
helps brighten up the mood.
I think I mentioned last time I had a Russian professor in college
who
had a cure for vodka. He cured the cold, but it took him several days to recover from the cure.
So maybe you want to just cut down on some of the shots. Okay, here's one that would hit everybody at home. Gluten is bad.
Yeah.
I've heard this one too.
Yeah, and we have to be careful about this because a lot of this has to do with how you measure and what goes on with regard to the science behind it. There is very clear indication that gluten as a wheat product and otherwise is a significant problem for people with celiac disease, which is a problem of the intestines.
Right.
And there is a second problem that has to deal with wheat allergies. That is true. It's not very common, but it's true.
Right.
And finally, another one that's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or NCGS. The issue here is that there are some specific diseases that have a problem. Right. So people who have celiac disease have to stay away from gluten because it definitely does interfere with their normal intestinal function.
They just can't digest it. Right?
They can't digest it. It becomes a real problem, and they get diarrhea, and they get all kinds of dehydration from the diarrhea. And
all that gross stuff.
All the gross stuff.
Okay. No details in this.
The question, though, is it's been very common for people to say, I don't want to have gluten, I'm going to have non-gluten diets. And frequently, that has to deal with symptomatology. Doesn't have anything to do with celiac disease, hopefully. Right. Doesn't have anything to do with a wheat allergy. But the same symptoms that have to deal with the NCGS, the non-celiac gluten sensitivity, are similar symptoms to what you get irregardless of gluten. So as a result of that, while people have been worried about it, it is very common to deal with headaches, fatigue, and joint pain. Well, some people get headaches, fatigue, and joint pain from high carb and high sugar diets.
Okay.
So if you have a high sugar, a high carb diet, you can get those same symptoms. Is it the same thing? No, it's not. And that's where the science fails here, where gluten bad for everybody is wrong. Gluten for celiac disease is a very important issue.
Well, okay. What is gluten good for?
Well, gluten is there as a wheat product. It helps to give substance, helps to give some sort of bulk to what's being eaten, adds to flavor, etc. But at the end of the day, the real question here is this a true statement to say that gluten is bad for everybody and we have to remove it from all diets? And the answer is no. There's no science behind that. There is definitely science behind celiac disease. But now the problem is, suppose that I eat a high carb, high sugar diet, and I get the same kind of symptoms with fatigue and joint pain and headaches, and I immediately think, oh, I have a sensitivity or an allergy or whatever to gluten, and the answer is maybe not. And there isn't any science behind it. There are also some questions about how to measure certain issues with gluten that have yet to be further refined. But at the end of the day, it's not necessarily bad for everybody. If you get these kind of symptoms, then take a look at your diet. Make sure that you've cut down on the sugar, on the carbs, etc., and then see if you still have the problems. And if so, then see your doctor.
Right, right. I mean, that sounds good.
Thank you.
I have nothing else to add to that. That's not normal. Anyways, moving on. Sitting is the new smoking.
Yeah, this is. I've written about this. My interns have heard about it, etc. There are several independent risk factors that have to deal with cardiovascular disease. One of them is smoking, for sure, that leads to people who have atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarcts, or heart attacks. But at the same time, obesity is an independent risk factor. So even if you're not smoking, you can still have the same risks from obesity and from a sedentary lifestyle where you're not moving, or you're sitting in front of the TV, or you're sitting reading for long periods of time. What this
Or
does,
you're sitting and working all day.
sitting and working all day, getting up periodically in order to deal with it, where they talk about sitting as the new smoking, the real issue here is it's an independent risk factor. So even if you don't have smoking, you can cause it. There's been studies that identify that sitting, in fact, is twice as bad as smoking. Obviously, sitting and smoking is definitely worse. But you have to understand that just because you don't do one and you do another doesn't relieve you from having high risk of cardiovascular disease. Sitting, sedentary lifestyle, obesity, smoking, these are all independent risk factors. They all influence what goes on. You have to pay attention to it. And you're right, Alex. Get up, move around.
Yeah.
If you're working, get up, move around. If you're sitting, periodically get up and move around. And especially, as people have talked, get out, take a walk, go swimming,
Some sunshine.
get some sunshine, play tennis, do whatever. But bottom line is move.
Golf counts, right?
Yes, golf can count.
Okay. Yeah, I'll get back to you on that one. All right, the next one is eating chocolate gives you acne.
Yeah, this is common, and I think all of us have heard this about it. The reality of it is there's no science behind it.
Oh, man, I've been deprived all these years.
Well, let's be clear about something. There is a diet that high sugars, high fats do lead to acne.
Okay.
So what we have to be careful with is that what you're talking about with chocolate was not added as part of a high fat, high sugar diet.
Right.
The acne is something that has to deal with decreasing the load of the high sugar, high fat diet more than the issue with eating chocolate. There's been studies on the chocolate. There's very little evidence that gives some sort of positive impact on it, but there was a lot of evidence that high sugar and high fat does. So if you're eating a lot of candy bars and there's a lot of sugar, a lot of fat, that can add to the acne issue, but it's not about the chocolate itself has a direct correlation with acne.
Okay. So I'm going to go just to dark chocolate.
Yeah,
I'll be all right.
yeah.
All right, here's one you're going to have to explain to me what this is. Because walking around barefoot on a cold floor will give you varicose veins. What is that?
Yeah, I haven't heard this one. This one,
What's
M
varicose
came up with. Varicose veins is where you see people that have those ugly kind of veins in their legs that look like the veins have kind of bubbled up, and sometimes they're malformed. They may be darker, a different color. You like someone who has smooth legs or something, and this unfortunately is not it.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of this one before, but the bottom line is that there is no scientific background for this. What this is that walking around on a cold floor means that you're losing your natural heat. So we talked about that before in remedies, where we were talking about having something on your skin like a greasy kind of liniment,
Right.
or an ointment would stop the heat from leaving as a result of that, causing more damage from a burn or an injury.
Right.
In this case, walking around with cold feet, you certainly have some insensible loss of heat, but the question is, does that specifically cause varicose veins? And the answer is no. There's no study behind that. The important issue here is that varicose veins are a genetic problem. If your mother had it, your grandmother had it, etc., you have a higher risk of varicose veins than you do for someone that didn't have it. Doesn't mean that you can't get it, but it does mean that it's genetic. So walking around on a cold floor is not going to change your genetic makeup from what you got from your mom and dad and grandparents, etc. This whole issue is just an issue where, you know, the issue kind of was driven, etc., by certain kinds of mobility disorders that are out there. And those mobility disorders do have a problem with bare feet on cold floor. They don't lead to varicose veins, because that's a genetically related kind of problem, but they do have where they add to more pain, certainly more inflammation and things like that. And so people have made kind of the link or the distinction that the mobility problem leads to other issues, including varicose veins. There's no science behind it. There's nothing specific about it, but it does identify that you're dealing with problems that occur. We call them in medicine comorbidities, which means that you may have a problem with diabetes or arthritis, but commonly other people also have similar problems in addition to that. And so anybody that has varicose veins, etc., that are related frequently is associated with that and say, okay, it causes it. No, these happen to be people who have that kind of a problem, but they also have several other kind of problems, and it's all having to do with mobility. So while people look at it and think that there's a causation, it's not. There isn't even an association. It's just people that have a problem can have another problem, another problem. A very simple example is it's very common for people to have something called metabolic syndrome, and that is they have diabetes, but they also have high blood pressure. They also have high cholesterol. That syndrome works together because it's so very common. And these kind of things with mobility also are very common, and have problems with joint pain and fibromyalgia and issues with regard to anxiety because you're nervous, because you're painful walking around stuff.
So what you're saying is that walking around barefoot on a cold floor, it'll heighten what's already there. Like if you already have pain and inflammation, it'll just bring out more pain and inflammation.
It may. It may not. It doesn't have anything to do with varicose veins.
Right.
Pardon me, but it does. It does have to deal with the fact that walking around can increase joint pain and other problems, and as a result of that, you're going to get symptoms.
Okay, and what was that?
No, so my mom still tells me that, like, every time, because I walk around barefoot as much as possible. Like, the minute I get home, my shoes are off.
I hope you clean your floor.
So, but they constantly yell at me, especially because they say, because of the varicose veins, but they also say that it causes bone pain, especially if your feet are hot and you step on a cold floor. You wanna tell my mom that she's wrong while you're at it?
Well, when I see her the next time, we'll have a chat. But to be fair,
I'm pretty sure she's not gonna like it.
just to be fair with everybody, my mother had several several things, and I could talk to her forever, and there was just no way that I was going to get through. So I understand entirely, and God bless my mother if she was still here. I would be more than happy to have that conversation knowing that I was losing before I started it, and I would have lost at the end of it.
Isn't it nice when you use facts but you still lose?
Just to be fair,
it's a wonderful world.
My mother smoked for 65 years. I said to her, "Mother, this is horrible, and your coughing and others are a problem." I brought home x-rays to show her what they look like. It didn't convince her. The only thing that stopped her was 1 year near the end of her life where they charged her a very large copay for going into the hospital, and she said to me, "They charged me all this money." I said, "Well, if you keep smoking and doing all of this, you're going to have to pay." That made her stop like that.
And then a light bulb goes off. Why didn't I think of this years ago? And on to our last belief. It's actually, before we get into that, walking around, the one I heard of walking around barefoot on a cold floor was the cold and flu also.
Yeah.
That seems to be a go-to. I'm seeing a trend here.
Yeah, well, the trend, as I've indicated, has to deal with being close to people who have colds or flu and are coughing and that. Having a cold has nothing to do with a cold. Being close to someone who's coughing on you definitely has something to do with a cold. So, yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
People are making these associations, but they may not necessarily have it. Just because something is associated may be common or uncommon. But if it is, that doesn't mean that it causes it.
Right. So next time you walk around barefoot on a cold floor, just make sure it's clean. Moving on, that sugar causes hyperactivity in children. It's true. I already know it. No need to even talk about it.
This is a sensitive subject, and we need to be careful about it. But let me try and address what went on. Number one, there isn't any science behind this, but I want to address what's going on. In the 1970s, there was a Dr. Feingold that made something known as the Feingold diet. What the Feingold diet identified was that there were certain dyes in foods and in drugs that people needed to avoid so that they didn't get these food additives or additional sugars that led to hyperactivity and in some cases ADHD or attention deficit disorder. The people have taken from that because in the food additive they have added the concept that, well, then sugar has to be part of food additives, and as a result of that, sugar causes hyperactivity. And they've made the association and relationship to ADHD. One is not causing, ADHD is a difficult diagnosis. It's difficult to diagnose and to address.
And it's often misdiagnosed.
It is often misdiagnosed, especially in adults, but also in children. But bottom line here is that the hyperactivity is not a issue that has any science behind it. What it does have is that food additives do add sugar, do make people a bit nervous or a bit hyper, and so they've associated that with what goes on in children as a common issue. In fact, it doesn't. There have been multiple studies, I think I even came up with a couple from Yale University, that there wasn't a deterioration of attention span with high sugar diets. But the decreasing of attention span with a high sugar diet was not an indication that it was hyperactivity in children. It was that you needed to cut down on the amount of sugar. So there's a sugar issue, but it's not necessarily a hyperactivity issue, and it certainly isn't part of ADHD. They may be associated, as we've talked about, where there's associations of what happens, but in this case, you're trying to address it. And there was a couple of studies from Dr. Wesnes and Dr. Tamberlane from Yale that identified higher levels of sugar produced higher levels of adrenaline, which is well known. That has nothing to do with hyperactivity, and that has a symptom or common symptom of hyperactivity or activity, but it's only because you ate too much sugar. So
Right.
if you lower the sugar, you're dealing with this not because you're going to be hyperactive all the time, but rather because it's a dose-response relationship. You ate too much sugar, and as a result of that, you got it. There is really no relationship, and there are some studies that have indicated that that sugar leads to depressing insulin and phenylalanine, which is interesting, but it's trying to give some theoretical impact to what goes on with neurotransmitters that are active in ADHD, effectively saying you have sugar, you've got hyperactivity, you've got ADHD, and trying to make an association when in fact there's not a causation. Some people eat too much sugar and they get hyperactive or they get tired, and as a result, what you have to do is lower the sugar, and that issue goes away.
So you're saying hyperactivity is not necessarily caused by sugar?
No.
But can hyperactivity just be, say, genetic?
Well, it's not so much genetic, it's a dose-response relationship.
Okay.
Where you give too much sugar and people can either get hyperactive or they can just be, lose attention span, or they can have some issues with regard to, some associations. People with ADHD, frequently you need to keep sugar away from them because there is a problem in what goes on with high sugar doses and what happens to insulin, and people bottom out with regard to their sugar amount and their insulin amounts. But the association is not there.
Right.
It's only that at the same time that this occurs, you also have these problems. Why does it matter? It matters because one thing you can do is actually address this by lowering the amount of sugar, and then these problems that are, if you will, side effects or otherwise go away. On the same token, if someone truly has a problem, then it doesn't matter how much sugar there is. They're going to be hyperactive irregardless.
Right.
Or they're going to lose attention span irregardless of the sugar. So one of them has a true diagnostic impact, and another one for ADHD and things like that.
Right.
And others, it's purely a dose response, like taking too much of a given drug and you get too much of the problem, and the answer is we're going to cut back on the dose so you don't have the same side effects and all of that.
Right.
That's really where it comes from.
Okay, I can understand that, because sugar can have any impact. I mean, just clarifying for what you're saying. Sugar can have an impact on a child, whether they have a high response, meaning they just become uncontrollable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or they just sit there and think of days off about other things.
They could.
Right.
They could. But then you lower the amount of sugar and you have something to treat.
You see the response. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. So, any other things you want to add to this topic?
No, I did tell Em that in the near future we'll have some pharmacy benefit news that'll come out that'll deal with some of the remedy issues and now also some of the belief issues, so people can see that and Em will attach it to these so that you can have them in the future and have something that you can agree with, disagree with, or otherwise. I'm sure some of them, if my mother were still alive, she'd be disagreeing as well. So.
I'm sure if we took calls, there'd be a lot of angry people on the phone right now. Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting topic, both the remedies and the beliefs. And if you have any at home, please feel free to send them to us any which way you can. DM, you can message us directly. You can go to our website and contact us through there. Our website is propharmaconsultants.com. We also have a free information page, which is called RxInfoX. It has various sources from news and headlines from what's going on today.
And drug prices.
It's a little ticker. You can look up the drug that you're currently taking and see what the acquisition cost is at the moment.
Yes.
And also, we will have a pharmacy benefit news regarding this coming up in the future. And anything else? Did I miss anything? No? We're good? Okay, and then we'll see you next week with a brand new topic. If you have any topics at home, feel free to send it to us. And we will see you next week.